In the 8th century before the Common Era, the landscape of central Italy was covered with scattered villages and farming communities. The Tiber River wound through green valleys, past 7 small hills that rose from the marshy ground like the knuckles of a sleeping giant. These hills would become the foundation of something extraordinary, though the people who first settled there could not have known it. The traditional founding date of Rome is 753 before the Common Era. But we must understand that this date, like so much of early Roman history, sits somewhere between memory and myth. The Romans themselves preserved stories that blended historical truth with poetic imagination, and these stories shaped their identity for 1,000 years. The founding myth tells of twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, abandoned as infants and nursed by a she-wolf in a cave at the base of the Palatine Hill. The story continues with their discovery by a shepherd, their growth into young men, and their decision to found a city on the spot where the wolf had saved them. But the brothers quarreled over which hill should be the center of their new city, and in the violence that followed, Romulus killed his brother and became the sole founder. Whether this story holds any historical truth is less important than what it reveals about how the Romans saw themselves. They were a people born from conflict, nursed by wildness, and shaped by the harsh necessity of survival. The she-wolf became their symbol, and fratricide became the dark stain at their origin, a reminder that greatness often emerges from violence. Archaeological evidence suggests that the actual founding of Rome was less dramatic and more gradual. Small Iron Age settlements on the Palatine and other hills slowly merged over the 8th and 7th centuries. These early Romans were Latin people, related to other tribes throughout the region. They built simple huts with thatched roofs and kept sheep and cattle in the valleys below their hilltop villages. The location they chose was strategic, though perhaps not obviously so at first glance. The 7 hills provided natural defensive positions. The Tiber River offered a route to the sea 15 miles to the west, allowing for trade while remaining far enough inland to avoid pirate raids. Just as importantly, this location sat at the intersection of salt trade routes. Salt from the coastal marshes traveled inland along paths that crossed the Tiber at Rome's location, making the settlement a natural meeting point for traders and travelers. For the first 2.5 centuries of Rome's existence, the city was ruled by kings. The Romans remembered 7 kings in total, though modern historians suspect the actual number may have been different and the timelines uncertain. But the stories of these kings, preserved in the writings of historians like Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, paint a picture of Rome's early development. The first king, according to tradition, was Romulus himself. He established the basic institutions of Roman society, including the Senate, a council of elders drawn from the leading families. He also performed the first religious rituals that would define Roman worship, marking boundaries with a plough and establishing the sacred space called the Pomerium. These early religious practices show us something important about the Roman mind. They saw the divine in boundaries, in thresholds, in doorways and borders. Their gods were not distant beings in some otherworldly location, but forces that inhabited specific places and moments. After Romulus, the tradition names Numa Pompilius as the second king. Where Romulus had been a warrior, Numa was remembered as a priest and lawgiver. He established the religious calendar, founded priesthoods, and built the first temples. In the Roman imagination, Numa represented order and piety, the necessary complement to Romulus's violent founding. The 3rd and 4th kings, Tullus Hostilius and Ancus Marcius, were warrior kings who expanded Roman territory through conquest and diplomacy. But with the 5th king, Tarquinius Priscus, the character of Rome's monarchy changed significantly. Tarquinius was said to be of Etruscan origin, from the sophisticated cities to the north. The Etruscans were the dominant civilization in central Italy at this time. Their cities, places like Veii and Tarquinia, possessed advanced engineering knowledge, sophisticated art, and complex political systems. They drained swamps, built temples with terracotta decorations, and created elaborate tombs filled with painted scenes of feasting and music. Under Etruscan influence, Rome transformed from a collection of hilltop villages into something resembling an actual city. Tarquinius Priscus began the construction of the great sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, which drained the marshy valley between the hills. This valley became the Forum, the civic heart of Rome, where citizens gathered for markets, elections, and religious festivals. The king also began construction of the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, which would become the most important religious site in Rome. This temple, completed by later kings, housed the statue of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Jupiter the best and greatest, along with statues of Juno and Minerva. These three deities formed the Capitoline Triad, protecting gods of the Roman state. The sixth king, Servius Tullius, made fundamental changes to Roman society. He organized the population into groups based on wealth rather than birth, creating the centuriate system that would shape Roman military and political life for centuries. Under this system, citizens were divided into classes according to their property. The wealthy, who could afford heavy armor and horses, formed the cavalry and heavy infantry. The less wealthy served as light infantry. The poorest citizens, the proletarii, owned no significant property and contributed only their children, their proles, to the state. This reorganization was more than military. It also determined voting rights. The wealthy classes voted first in the assembly, and because voting stopped once a majority was reached, they often decided matters before the poorer classes could cast their votes. This system, which mixed elements of equality and hierarchy, would remain characteristic of Roman political thought. All citizens had rights, but not all citizens had equal influence. Servius Tullius also extended the city walls, enclosing all 7 hills within a single defensive circuit. The Servian Wall, as it came to be called, defined Rome's sacred boundary and protected a city that now covered an area of more than 400 acres. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, became the archetype of the tyrant in Roman memory. The stories about him describe a ruler who used violence and intimidation to maintain power, who ignored the Senate and the traditional checks on royal authority, and who involved Rome in costly wars to enhance his own prestige. The breaking point came, according to legend, when the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius, assaulted a noblewoman named Lucretia. Lucretia's suicide, presented as an act of honor in a society that valued chastity and shame, sparked a revolution. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, the Roman aristocracy rose up, expelled the Tarquin family, and vowed never again to tolerate a king. This revolution, traditionally dated to 509 before the Common Era, marked the end of the monarchy and the beginning of the Republic. But we should pause here and consider what life was actually like in this archaic Rome, beyond the dramatic stories of kings and revolutions. The Rome of the 6th century was still a small city, perhaps with a population of 20 to 30,000 people. Most Romans lived in simple houses made of wood and mud brick. The wealthy had larger homes with multiple rooms arranged around an atrium, an open courtyard that collected rainwater in a central pool. The poorer citizens lived in smaller structures, sometimes just 1 or 2 rooms. Daily life revolved around agriculture, even for city dwellers. Many Romans maintained small plots of land outside the city walls, where they grew grain, olives, and grapes. The Roman diet was simple but sufficient. Bread or porridge made from wheat or barley formed the foundation. Vegetables like cabbage, lettuce, and onions supplemented the grain. Meat was relatively rare, reserved for festivals and special occasions. The family, the familia, was the fundamental unit of Roman society. The father, the paterfamilias, held absolute authority over all family members, including adult sons, daughters, wives, and slaves. This authority, called patria potestas, was nearly unlimited by law. The paterfamilias controlled all family property, arranged marriages for his children, and could even, in theory, execute family members for serious offences. This sounds harsh to modern ears, but in practice, the authority was tempered by social expectations and the advice of family councils. Roman society valued dignitas, the dignity that came from proper behaviour and respect. A paterfamilias who abused his authority would lose respect in the community, and without respect, political and social advancement became difficult. Women in early Rome occupied a complex position. They could not vote or hold political office, and they remained under the legal authority of their fathers or husbands. But within the household, the materfamilias, the mother of the family, held significant practical authority. She managed the household, supervised slaves and servants, educated young children, and often controlled substantial property through inheritance. Religion permeated every aspect of daily life. The Romans believed that divine forces, called noumena, inhabited everything. The doorway had its god, Janus. The hearth had its goddess, Vesta. The boundary stones that marked property lines were protected by the god Terminus. Each family maintained its own household shrines, where they honoured the lares, protective spirits of the home, and the penates, guardians of the storeroom. These domestic rituals were simple but carefully maintained. Each day the family would offer a portion of their meal to the lares, placing it on the household altar. During important family events, births, marriages, deaths, special offerings would be made. This constant attention to ritual created a sense that the human and divine worlds were intimately connected, that proper behaviour toward the gods ensured stability and prosperity. Public religion was equally important. The state maintained numerous priesthoods, each responsible for specific rituals. The pontiff supervised the religious calendar and advised magistrates on religious law. The augurs interpreted signs from the gods, particularly the flight of birds and the behaviour of sacred chickens. Before any important public action, from holding an election to starting a war, the augurs would take the auspices, observing the natural world for divine approval or disapproval. This system of religion was not primarily about belief in the way we might understand it today. The Romans were less concerned with faith or doctrine and more concerned with correct practice, with performing the rituals properly. This emphasis on orthopraxy rather than orthodoxy made Roman religion remarkably flexible. They could incorporate foreign gods and foreign practices without contradiction, as long as the traditional rituals continue to be performed correctly. The expulsion of the kings and the foundation of the Republic grew from this same community of aristocratic families who controlled the priesthoods, who formed the Senate, and who expected to have a voice in governance. They had grown tired of royal authority and wanted to govern themselves through collective decision-making. But this new system they were about to create would not be a democracy in any modern sense. It would be an oligarchy tempered by popular assemblies, a system that balanced competing interests in ways both ingenious and frustrating. And it would carry Rome from a small city-state on the Tiber to mastery over the entire Mediterranean world. As we prepare to explore the Republic's rise, it helps to picture that moment of transition. 509 years before the Common Era. Imagine the Forum at dawn, the sun just beginning to illuminate the still unfinished Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. The last Etruscan workers pack their tools, knowing the king who hired them will not return. Patrician families gather in small groups, discussing this new form of government they are inventing, making it up as they go, drawing on Greek examples and their own traditions. They cannot know what they are beginning. They cannot foresee the centuries of struggle and triumph ahead. They know only that they have rejected monarchy and that they must now find another way to govern themselves. And in this moment of uncertainty and possibility, the Roman Republic takes its first breath. The new government that emerged after the expulsion of the kings was not planned in advance. It evolved through trial and error, through crisis and compromise, until it took a form that would endure for nearly 500 years. The Romans called their system res publica, the public thing, the commonwealth. We translate it simply as republic. At the heart of the new system were two magistrates called consuls. These men held the executive power that had once belonged to the kings, but with crucial limitations. They served for only 1 year, and there were always two of them, each with the power to veto the other's decisions. This principle of collegiality and limited tenure became fundamental to Roman political thought. Consuls were elected by the Centuriate Assembly, the body of citizens organized into voting groups based on wealth. Only former magistrates could be elected consul, which meant that in practice, the office circulated among a small number of aristocratic families. These families, the patricians, trace their lineages back to the original Senate established by Romulus. But Rome also contained another class of citizens, the plebeians. These were free Roman citizens who lacked the ancestral prestige of the patricians. They might be farmers, merchants, or craftsmen. Some were quite wealthy, but they were excluded from the highest offices and from the major priesthoods. The tension between patricians and plebeians shaped the first 2 centuries of the Republic. This conflict, called the conflict of the orders, was not a simple struggle between rich and poor. Rather, it was a political struggle between an established aristocracy and an emerging class of citizens who demanded a share of political power. The first major crisis came in 494 before the Common Era, around 15 years after the founding of the Republic. Debt had become a crushing burden for many small farmers. When they could not pay, they fell into debt bondage, a form of slavery that bound them to their creditors. The patrician consuls and senate refused to address the problem. In response, the plebeians did something remarkable. They left. They withdrew from the city and established a camp on the Sacred Mount, a hill outside Rome's walls. This act, called a secession, was a form of protest that revealed both the strength and the vulnerability of early Roman society. The patricians needed the plebeians. They needed them as soldiers, as farmers, as the foundation of the state's military and economic power. Without them, Rome could not function. A compromise was reached. The plebeians returned to the city, and in exchange, they gained their own representatives, officials called tribunes of the plebs. These tribunes had a single but powerful right. They could veto any action by a magistrate that harmed a plebeian. This veto power, backed by the tribune's sacrosanctity, their protection by religious law against violence, became a crucial check on patrician authority. Over the next 200 years, the plebeians gradually gained more rights. In 450 before the Common Era, Roman law was codified in the 12 tables. These laws, inscribed on bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum, made the legal system transparent. Now everyone could know what the law said, reducing the ability of patrician magistrates to interpret law arbitrarily. In 367 before the Common Era, the Licinian Sextian laws required that one of the two consuls must be a plebeian. By 300 before the Common Era, plebeians could hold all offices, including the major priesthoods. The distinction between patrician and plebeian never disappeared entirely, but it ceased to be the primary dividing line in Roman politics. What emerged was a new aristocracy, the nobiles, composed of both patrician and wealthy plebeian families whose ancestors had held high office. This nobility dominated Roman politics, but they competed fiercely among themselves for honor and position. The political system they operated within was complex, with multiple assemblies, numerous magistracies, and an array of social customs that regulated behavior. Let us pause and try to understand how this system actually worked. Imagine a young Roman from a noble family, perhaps 30 years old, beginning his political career. He would start by seeking election as quaestor, a financial official who assisted consuls and governors. 20 quaestors were elected each year, so competition was manageable for someone with family connections and moderate ability. After serving as quaestor, our young man would automatically become a member of the Senate. This body of 300 men, later expanded to 600, served as the primary advisory council of the state. Senators held their positions for life, unless they committed some act that caused the censors to remove them. The Senate had no formal legislative power, but it possessed immense practical authority. It controlled finances, directed foreign policy, assigned military commands, and guided the state through emergencies. When a consul or other magistrate sought advice on any important matter, he consulted the Senate. And while he was not legally bound to follow the Senate's recommendation, ignoring it was politically dangerous. After serving as quaestor, our ambitious young Roman would wait several years before seeking the next office, the praetorship. Praetors served as judges and could command armies when needed. Only 6 or 8 were elected each year, so competition was fierce. Success required not only family connections, but also demonstrated ability and the cultivation of popular support. Finally, after serving as praetor and waiting the required interval, he might seek the consulship. Only 2 men each year reached this pinnacle. The competition was intense, involving elaborate gift-giving to constituents, public speeches, and the mobilization of family networks. The consul's year in office brought both glory and responsibility. He had the right to wear a toga with a purple border. He was preceded by 12 lictors, attendants who carried the fasces, bundles of rods with an axe in the center, symbolizing the power to beat and execute. He commanded armies, presided over the Senate, and had his name attached to the year. Romans dated events by consular years, saying something happened in the year of Brutus and Collatinus, or the year of Fabius and Decius. After the consulship, the highest honor was the censorship. Censors, 2 elected every 5 years, conducted the census of Roman citizens, assigned people to their appropriate classes and tribes, and reviewed the Senate membership. They also supervised public morals and could mark a citizen with infamia, disgrace, for behavior that violated community standards. This system, with its checks and balances, its competition and collegiality, was designed to prevent any single individual from gaining too much power. But it also created constant political maneuvering. Roman politics was a complex dance of alliances and rivalries, favors given and called in, public positions carefully calculated to appeal to different constituencies. While this political drama unfolded, Rome was expanding beyond the 7 hills. In the early Republic, Rome was just one city-state among many in Italy. The Etruscans to the north, the Samnites in the central mountains, the Greek cities in the south, All were potential rivals or enemies. Roman expansion in Italy was neither planned nor systematic. It happened through a series of wars, each fought for immediate security concerns or in response to conflicts with neighbors. But the cumulative effect was dramatic. By 270 before the Common Era, Rome controlled all of Italy south of the Po River. The key to Rome's success was not superior military technology or larger population. Rather, it was their genius for incorporation. When Rome defeated an enemy, they rarely attempted to govern them directly. Instead, they created a complex network of alliances and treaties. Some defeated communities became full Roman citizens. Others received Latin rights, an intermediate status that gave them some citizenship privileges. Still others became allies, required to provide troops for Roman armies, but otherwise left to govern themselves. This system created a vast pool of manpower. By the time of Rome's conflict with Carthage, they could field armies totaling hundreds of thousands of soldiers, drawing on communities throughout Italy. This capacity to absorb losses and continue fighting would prove decisive. The war with Carthage, the Punic Wars as they came to be called, transformed Rome from an Italian power into a Mediterranean empire. Carthage was a Phoenician city-state in North Africa, near modern Tunis. Through centuries of trade and conquest, it had built a maritime empire spanning western Mediterranean. Carthaginian ships controlled the seas. Their merchants traded in every port from Spain to Egypt. The First Punic War began in 264 before the Common Era over control of Sicily. This war, lasting 23 years, was fought primarily at sea, despite Rome having virtually no naval tradition. The Romans, characteristically, approached this deficiency with typical practicality. They captured a Carthaginian warship, used it as a model, and built a fleet of similar vessels. To compensate for their inexperience in naval warfare, they invented a boarding bridge, the corvus, that locked onto enemy ships and allowed Roman soldiers to board and fight as if on land. This innovation, combined with Rome's seemingly endless supply of soldiers and willingness to absorb catastrophic losses, eventually wore down Carthage. When the First Punic War ended in 241, Rome had gained Sicily, its first overseas province. The island would be governed not as part of the Roman alliance system, but as a subject territory, taxed and administered by Roman officials. This marked a significant shift in Roman imperial practice. The Second Punic War, from 218 to 201, was far more dangerous. It began when Hannibal Barca, one of history's great military commanders, marched an army from Spain through southern Gaul and across the Alps into Italy. This march, achieved with elephants and thousands of soldiers through mountain passes in winter, remains one of the most remarkable military achievements of the ancient world. Hannibal won victory after victory on Italian soil. At the Battle of Cannae in 216, he destroyed a Roman army of perhaps 50,000 men, killing most of them in a single afternoon. The disaster was so complete that for years afterward, Roman mothers would frighten their children by saying, "Hannibal ad portas," Hannibal is at the gates. But Rome did not surrender. This is perhaps the most revealing moment in Roman history. After Cannae, with Hannibal's army ravaging Italy, with many of Rome's allies defecting, the Senate met. When someone suggested opening negotiations with Hannibal, the Senate refused to even discuss the possibility. They sent out orders for new armies to be raised, new taxes to be levied, and continued the war. The war dragged on for 17 years. Hannibal could not be dislodged from Italy, but Rome prevented him from receiving reinforcements or achieving a decisive strategic victory. Meanwhile, a young Roman commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio took the war to Spain, defeating Carthaginian armies there, and then crossed to North Africa. Faced with a Roman army threatening Carthage itself, Hannibal was recalled from Italy. In 202, at the Battle of Zama in North Africa, Scipio defeated Hannibal, ending the war. Scipio earned the honorific name Africanus, and Rome emerged as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. The Third Punic War, from 149 to 146, was less a war than an execution. Carthage had recovered economically, but remained militarily weak. A faction in the Roman Senate, led by Marcus Porcius Cato, insisted that Carthage must be destroyed. Cato is said to have ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the words, "Carthago delenda est." Carthage must be destroyed. Rome manufactured a pretext for war, besieged Carthage, and after 3 years of resistance, destroyed the city completely. The buildings were razed, the population was killed or sold into slavery. According to tradition, though this may be apocryphal, the Romans ploughed the ground where Carthage had stood and sowed it with salt. The message was clear. This was what happened to those who challenged Rome. But while Rome was fighting Carthage in the west, it was also being drawn into conflicts in the east, into the complex world of Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged after Alexander the Great's death. The kings of Macedon, Syria, and Egypt ruled vast territories with armies trained in Greek military traditions and cities adorned with Greek art and architecture. Rome initially entered these conflicts reluctantly, as an ally of smaller states appealing for protection against larger powers. But once engaged, Rome found it difficult to disengage. War followed war. Macedon was defeated, then defeated again, and finally annexed as a province. The Seleucid Empire in Syria was defeated and reduced to a client state. Egypt remained independent longer, but increasingly under Roman influence. By 133, before the Common Era, Rome controlled or dominated the entire Mediterranean world. Roman governors ruled provinces in Spain, Africa, Macedon, Greece, and Asia Minor. Roman merchants traded in every port. Roman armies could march from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. But this expansion created profound problems at home. The traditional Roman citizen soldier, the farmer who left his fields to fight for a season and then returned to his plough, was disappearing. Wars now lasted for years and took place far from Italy. Soldiers served abroad for extended campaigns, and when they finally returned home, they often found their farms ruined, their families impoverished. Meanwhile, the wealth from conquered provinces was flowing to Rome, but not evenly. The senatorial aristocracy, who governed provinces and awarded contracts for tax collection and public works, enriched themselves enormously. Large estates, worked by enslaved people captured in Rome's wars, replaced small farms. The displacement of small farmers created a growing urban population in Rome itself, people who owned no land, had no secure employment, and whose discontent would fuel political crisis. Roman society at the height of the Republic was both impressive and troubling. The city itself had grown to perhaps 500,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. The Forum was surrounded by temples, basilicas for legal proceedings, and monuments commemorating military victories. Aqueducts brought fresh water from distant mountains. Public baths provided places for socializing and exercise. Markets offered goods from across the Mediterranean. For the wealthy, life could be quite pleasant. They lived in spacious houses with gardens, libraries, and dining rooms decorated with frescoes. They attended elaborate dinner parties where they reclined on couches while enslaved attendants brought course after course of food. They discussed philosophy, read Greek literature, and sponsored artists and poets. But for the poor, life was precarious. They lived in cramped apartment blocks, insulae, that were prone to fire and collapse. They worked as day laborers, porters, street vendors, anything that might earn enough for bread and rent. They depended on the grain dole, the public distribution of wheat that kept them from starvation, and on the entertainment provided by public games. The Roman family remained the basic social unit, but it was changing. The power of the paterfamilias was gradually being limited by law. Women of the upper classes gained more independence, controlling their own property and participating in social life more freely, though always without direct political power. Enslaved people were everywhere. They worked in fields and mines, in workshops and households. Some were treated well, others brutally. Some could earn or purchase their freedom, becoming freedmen and freedwomen who formed an intermediate social class. But the system depended on a constant supply of captives from Rome's wars, which meant that Rome's expansion and its social structure were intimately connected. This was the Republic at its zenith, powerful and prosperous, but also deeply unequal and increasingly unstable. The political system designed for a small city-state was struggling to govern an empire. The checks and balances that had prevented tyranny now prevented necessary reforms, and into this moment of tension and possibility would emerge individuals who would challenge the old order, men who would use the Republic's own institutions to transform it into something else entirely. But before we meet those men, let us rest in this moment. Picture a summer evening in Rome, perhaps in 135 before the Common Era. The sun sets behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. In the Forum, the shadows lengthen across marble and stone. Senators in white togas walk in small groups, discussing the day's business. A baker closes his shop. A mother calls her children home. The city settles into its evening rhythms, unaware of the storms to come. In 133 before the Common Era, a young tribune named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus stood before the plebeian assembly and proposed a law. The law seemed simple enough. It would limit the amount of public land any individual could hold and redistribute the excess to landless citizens. But this proposal, and the violent resistance it provoked, marked the beginning of a century of civil conflict that would destroy the Republic. Tiberius Gracchus came from one of Rome's most distinguished families. His grandfather was Scipio Africanus, the conqueror of Hannibal. His father had been consul twice. By birth and education, he was a member of the aristocracy, but he had also served as a young officer in Spain, where he witnessed the poverty of Roman soldiers and the consolidation of land into vast estates. His land reform threatened the interests of many senators who had accumulated enormous holdings of public land. They argued that his proposal violated property rights and tradition. They pointed out that he was bypassing the Senate and appealing directly to the people. They whispered that he aimed at tyranny, at making himself a king. When the Senate could not block the law through normal channels, they resorted to violence. As Tiberius sought re-election as tribune to protect his reforms, a group of senators and their followers attacked him and his supporters during the election. Tiberius was beaten to death with pieces of broken furniture. His body was thrown into the Tiber River, denied proper burial. This was unprecedented. Political conflict had always been fierce in Rome, but it had not previously ended in the murder of magistrates. The killing of Tiberius Gracchus broke an invisible barrier, and violence began to enter the political arena. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, became tribune and pursued even more radical reforms. He renewed the land redistribution program. He established colonies of Roman citizens overseas. He proposed extending citizenship to Rome's Italian allies. Most controversially, he changed how provinces were taxed, empowering the equestrian class, the wealthy non-senatorial merchants and publicans, at the Senate's expense. Gaius was a more skilled politician than his brother, but he too met a violent end. In 121, the Senate passed what would become a recurring emergency decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, authorizing the consuls to take any measures necessary to defend the state. Using this authority, they attacked Gaius's supporters. Thousands were killed. Gaius ordered his enslaved attendant to kill him rather than be captured. The Gracchi brothers had tried to address real social problems, but their methods, appealing to popular assemblies against the Senate and the Senate's violent response, set dangerous precedents. Politics was becoming a zero-sum game where losing meant not just defeat, but death. The next crisis came from an unexpected direction, from Rome's Italian allies. These communities had fought alongside Rome for centuries. They provided troops for Roman armies. They followed Roman foreign policy. But they lacked Roman citizenship and the legal protections it offered. When their demands for citizenship were repeatedly rejected, many Italian communities revolted in 91 before the Common Era. This social war, as it was called, from the Latin soci, meaning allies, was devastating. Italian armies used Roman tactics because they had learned them while fighting for Rome. The war was brutal, fought between communities that had been partners for generations. Rome won, but only by finally granting citizenship to the Italians, which had been their demand all along. This expansion of citizenship would have profound effects. Italy was now filled with Roman citizens, all with voting rights, though difficulty of traveling to Rome to vote meant that most would never exercise those rights directly. But the social war had introduced new dynamics into Roman politics. Two commanders had risen to prominence during the conflict, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Their rivalry would plunge Rome into its first full-scale civil war. Marius was a military genius and a reformer. He came from a family of moderate wealth, but not nobility. His rise to the consulship, which he held an unprecedented 7 times, broke traditional patterns. More importantly, he reformed the Roman army. Previously, soldiers had to own property and provide their own equipment. Marius opened enrollment to the propertyless citizens, the capitae censi. The state provided weapons and equipment. This created a professional army, but it also created a new problem. These soldiers looked to their generals, not the state, for rewards and land after service. The loyalty of armies was becoming personal, tied to individual commanders. Sulla, by contrast, was a patrician, though from an impoverished branch of his family. He was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. He had served under Marius and resented being overshadowed by him. When political circumstances gave him command of a lucrative war against King Mithridates of Pontus, and then the popular assemblies tried to transfer that command to Marius, Sulla did something unthinkable. He marched his legions on Rome. Never before had a Roman commander turned his army against the city. Soldiers had always refused such orders, but Sulla's soldiers were loyal to him personally. They followed him. Sulla captured Rome, executed or exiled his enemies, including Marius, and then departed to fight Mithridates in the east. But once he was gone, his enemies returned. Marius, now an old man driven by rage and vengeance, took control of Rome and conducted a purge of Sulla's supporters. When Marius died shortly after, his allies continued to hold power. Sulla returned from the east in 83, before the Common Era, with a victorious army, and proceeded to reconquer Italy. The civil war that followed was horrific. Battles were fought throughout Italy. Cities were sacked. Soldiers fought their former comrades. When Sulla finally won, he conducted a systematic purge of his enemies, unlike anything Rome had seen before. He posted lists called proscription lists, naming men who were declared enemies of the state. Anyone could kill a prescribed person and receive a reward. The person's property was confiscated and auctioned. Thousands died, not necessarily because they had opposed Sulla actively, but because they were wealthy and their property was needed to reward Sulla's veterans. Sulla then did something unusual. He had himself appointed dictator, but not in the traditional Roman sense of an emergency magistrate holding power for 6 months. Instead, he was made dictator for the purpose of reforming the state with no time limit. He held absolute power and used it to restructure the republic, strengthening the Senate, limiting the power of tribunes, and attempting to prevent future civil wars. Then, having reshaped the state according to his vision, he resigned. In 79 before the Common Era, Sulla voluntarily gave up absolute power and retired to his estates. He died the following year of natural causes, a private citizen. Sulla's resignation did not restore stability. His reforms satisfied no one. Those he had purged wanted vengeance. Those he had enriched wanted to keep their gains. The fundamental problems remained. Armies were loyal to generals. Political competition was a matter of life and death. The system could not contain the ambitions and fears it generated. Into this unstable environment emerged 3 men who would form an informal alliance to control the state. They were Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known as Pompey, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. History would call their arrangement the First Triumvirate, though at the time it was simply a private political agreement. Pompey was Rome's most successful general. He had fought for Sulla during the Civil War, earned the nickname Magnus, the Great, while still in his 20s, and conducted successful campaigns in Spain against Mediterranean pirates and in the East. He had a gift for warfare and for self-promotion. He also had a dangerous ambition and a thin skin when it came to perceived slights to his honor. Crassus was the richest man in Rome. He had made his fortune in real estate, notoriously by buying burning buildings at low prices, and through the proscriptions under Sulla. He had suppressed the great slave revolt led by Spartacus, though Pompey had stolen some of the credit. Crassus wanted military glory to match his wealth, but he was a better businessman than general. Caesar was, at this point, merely a rising politician from an ancient but not particularly prominent patrician family. He was charming, intelligent, and deeply in debt from financing his political career. He had served as quaestor, aedile, and pontifex maximus, the chief priest of Rome, but he lacked the military reputation of Pompey or the wealth of Crassus. The 3 men formed their alliance in 60 before the Common Era. Pompey and Crassus used their influence to secure Caesar's election as consul for 59. Caesar, as consul, pushed through legislation favoring his partners, ignoring Senate opposition and using intimidation when necessary. In return, Caesar received a special command in Gaul, the region encompassing modern France and Belgium. What Caesar did in Gaul transformed him from a politician into a conqueror. Over 9 years, from 58 to 50, he conquered the entirety of Gaul, subjugating hundreds of tribes, founding colonies, and crossing the Rhine into Germany and the English Channel into Britain. These last expeditions were more demonstrations than conquests, but they captured the Roman imagination. Caesar was a military genius, but he was also a masterful writer. He wrote commentaries on his campaigns, describing them in clear, elegant Latin that made him a hero to the Roman people. He portrayed himself as a civilizer, bringing Roman law and order to barbarian lands. His soldiers loved him because he shared their hardships and enriched them with plunder. His enemies in Rome feared him because his army was becoming the most powerful force in the Roman world. Meanwhile, the political situation in Rome was deteriorating. Violence became routine. Rival gangs controlled the streets. Elections were bought openly. The Senate was paralyzed by fear and faction. In 53, Crassus led an army against Parthia, Rome's great rival in the east, seeking military glory to match Caesar's. He was defeated and killed at the Battle of Carrhae, where Parthian horse archers destroyed his legions in the desert. With Crassus dead, the triumvirate dissolved. The Senate, increasingly fearful of Caesar, drew closer to Pompey. They appointed Pompey sole consul, an unprecedented position, and gave him authority to restore order in Rome. Then they began to maneuver against Caesar. They demanded he give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen, knowing that without his army and imperium, his legal authority as a magistrate, he could be prosecuted by his enemies. Caesar tried to negotiate. He offered to give up his army if Pompey did the same. The Senate, encouraged by Pompey's assurances that he could defeat Caesar if necessary, refused. They passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, declaring Caesar a public enemy if he did not lay down his command. Caesar faced a choice. He could obey, return to Rome without his army, and face almost certain prosecution, exile, or death. Or he could refuse and march on Rome. In January of 49 before the Common Era, Caesar stood at the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. According to tradition, he paused, knowing that crossing with his army would be an act of treason, and then said, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The civil war that followed lasted 5 years and spread across the Roman world. Caesar moved with characteristic speed, marching down the Italian peninsula so quickly that Pompey and most of the Senate fled to Greece before organizing resistance. Caesar consolidated his control of Italy and Spain, then crossed to Greece, where he faced Pompey's larger army. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48, Caesar's veterans defeated Pompey's less experienced legions. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered by courtiers hoping to curry favor with Caesar. Caesar followed Pompey to Egypt, where he became involved in a dynastic dispute and famously began an affair with Queen Cleopatra. He then campaigned in Asia Minor, moving so quickly from one victory to another that he reported back to Rome with just 3 words: Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. The remaining senatorial forces regrouped in North Africa and then in Spain, where Caesar defeated them in a series of increasingly desperate battles. By 45 before the Common Era, Caesar's enemies were destroyed or had submitted. He returned to Rome as master of the Roman world. What exactly was Caesar? He held various titles: dictator, consul, pontifex maximus. He received honors from the Senate, the right to wear a purple toga, a gold chair in the Senate House, the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. But these titles and honors did not capture his actual position. He was something new, a sole ruler in a state that had defined itself by its rejection of monarchy. Caesar implemented reforms at a stunning pace. He reorganized the calendar, creating what we now call the Julian calendar. He expanded the Senate to 900 members, adding supporters from Italy and the provinces. He founded colonies for veterans. He began massive building projects. He planned campaigns against Parthia and the peoples beyond the Danube. But he also acted in ways that troubled Romans. He placed his image on coins, something no living Roman had done. He allowed statues of himself to be set up throughout the city. There were rumors that he would have himself declared king, a title still toxic to Roman ears. A conspiracy formed among senators who feared Caesar's power and resented his domination. Some were former enemies he had pardoned. Some were former friends who felt betrayed or passed over. They were led by Marcus Junius Brutus, whom Caesar had treated almost as a son, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, a capable general and administrator. On the Ides of March, the 15th day of March, in 44 before the Common Era, Caesar attended a meeting of the Senate in Pompey's theatre. The conspirators surrounded him and stabbed him repeatedly. According to the ancient sources, Caesar defended himself until he saw Brutus among his attackers. Then he pulled his toga over his face and allowed himself to be killed. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, bleeding from 23 wounds. The conspirators had expected Romans to celebrate Caesar's death as liberation from tyranny. Instead, the city erupted in chaos. The urban poor, who had loved Caesar for his generosity and reforms, rioted. At Caesar's funeral, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and consul, gave a speech that inflamed the crowd. They cremated Caesar's body in the Forum and hunted the conspirators through the streets. Brutus and Cassius fled east to gather armies. Mark Antony took control in Rome, and then, unexpectedly, a new player emerged. Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, Gaius Octavius, arrived in Rome to claim his inheritance. He was 18 years old. Most observers expected Octavian, as he came to be called, to be swept aside by the adult players in this game. But he proved to be a masterful politician. He allied with Caesar's veterans. He made a temporary alliance with the Senate against Antony. Then, when that served its purpose, he abandoned the Senate and formed a three-way alliance with Antony and another of Caesar's lieutenants, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. This second triumvirate, unlike the first, was official and legal. The three men were appointed triumvirs for the restoration of the Republic, given extraordinary powers for 5 years. They divided the Roman world among themselves and conducted proscriptions that matched Sulla's for brutality. In 42 before the Common Era, Antony and Octavian crossed to Greece and defeated Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi. Both conspirators committed suicide after their defeat. The Republic they had tried to save by killing Caesar was now indisputably dead. But the triumvirate could not last. Lepidus was gradually sidelined and forced into retirement. That left Antony and Octavian. Antony took the wealthy east, establishing himself in Alexandria with Cleopatra. Octavian took the west, including Italy, and the difficult task of settling veterans on land confiscated from Italian communities. The final confrontation came in 31 before the Common Era. Octavian declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra, portraying the conflict as Rome against a foreign queen. At the naval battle of Actium, off the coast of Greece, Octavian's fleet, commanded by his friend Agrippa, defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. The following year, Octavian invaded Egypt. Facing inevitable defeat, both Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. Egypt, the last of the great Hellenistic kingdoms, became a Roman province. Octavian returned to Rome as the sole master of the Roman world. He was 33 years old. He had been fighting civil wars for more than a decade. The Roman world was exhausted. People wanted peace, stability, order. They wanted an end to the blood and chaos. And Octavian would give them that, but in a way that would transform the Republic into something entirely different. Something that would be called, eventually, an empire. In 27 before the Common Era, Octavian appeared before the Senate and performed an act of political theatre that would define the next 300 years of Roman history. He announced that he was restoring the Republic. He surrendered his extraordinary powers. He placed the governance of the state back in the hands of the Senate and the Roman people. The Senate, which Octavian controlled through patronage and fear, immediately refused to accept his resignation. They begged him to continue guiding the state. They granted him a large province to govern, encompassing Spain, Gaul, and Syria, the regions where most of the Roman legions were stationed. They gave him the title Augustus, a religious term suggesting reverence and majesty, and they granted him imperium maius, authority greater than that of other magistrates. What Augustus, as we must now call him, had created was a masterpiece of misdirection. He claimed to have restored the Republic. The Senate met, consuls were elected, magistrates held office. All the traditional forms continued, but real power rested with Augustus. He controlled the armies through his provincial command. He controlled finances through his access to the wealth of Egypt, which he governed as a personal possession. He controlled politics through his auctoritas, his prestige and influence. Augustus was careful never to appear as a king or dictator. He held various republican offices at different times, but always presented himself as merely the first citizen, the princeps. This term, from which we derive the word prince, suggested leadership without autocracy. He was simply the most distinguished senator, the most honored citizen, the one whose advice naturally carried the most weight. This carefully constructed fiction worked because Rome desperately wanted it to work. The civil wars had exhausted the Roman world. A generation had grown up knowing nothing but conflict and insecurity. Augustus offered peace, and Romans were willing to accept his veiled monarchy in exchange for stability. The peace Augustus established is called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It lasted, with some interruptions, for more than 200 years. Throughout this vast period, the Mediterranean world experienced a level of peace, prosperity, and interconnection that would not be matched again until modern times. Augustus reorganized the provinces, distinguishing between senatorial provinces, which were peaceful and could be governed by regular magistrates, and imperial provinces, which housed legions and required military expertise. He professionalized the army, creating a standing force of 28 legions, approximately 150,000 men, supplemented by equal numbers of auxiliary troops drawn from non-citizen populations. These soldiers served for 20 years, receiving a salary and, upon discharge, a bonus of land or money. This system solved the problem that had plagued the late Republic. Soldiers now looked to the emperor, not individual generals, for their rewards. The army became a state institution rather than a personal following. Augustus also created the Praetorian Guard, an elite force stationed in and around Rome. Officially, these troops protected the emperor and maintained order in the capital. In practice, they would become a dangerous political force capable of making and unmaking emperors. Beyond military and political reforms, Augustus transformed the physical appearance of Rome. He supposedly boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. This was an exaggeration, but it contained truth. He built or restored temples throughout the city. He constructed a new forum with a temple to Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger. He built a vast mausoleum for himself and his family. He encouraged his wealthy supporters to fund public works. The Rome that emerged from this building program was a city of monuments, a capital worthy of an empire. White marble buildings reflected the Mediterranean sun, temples crowned the hills, aqueducts brought water from distant mountains. Public baths, theatres, and porticos offered spaces for leisure and socializing. Augustus also promoted moral and religious reform. He passed laws encouraging marriage and childbearing among citizens. He revived ancient religious ceremonies that had fallen into neglect. He presented himself as a restorer of traditional Roman values, even while he was transforming the nature of Roman government. In his private life, Augustus lived relatively simply, at least by imperial standards. His house on the Palatine Hill was large, but not extravagant. He ate modest meals. He wore simple togas rather than elaborate dress. This carefully cultivated image of republican simplicity helped maintain the fiction that he was merely a citizen among citizens. Augustus's greatest challenge was succession. He had no sons. His only child was a daughter, Julia, and Roman law and custom did not allow direct female succession to power. He adopted his grandsons, but they died young. He adopted his stepson Tiberius, the capable but gloomy general, largely out of necessity. When Augustus died in 14 of the Common Era, at the age of 75, after ruling for more than 40 years, Tiberius succeeded him smoothly. This peaceful transition was itself a victory. For the first time in Roman history, supreme power passed from one individual to another without civil war. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, as historians call the line of emperors descended from Augustus through adoption and marriage, would rule for another 50 years. Tiberius was a competent but increasingly paranoid ruler who eventually retired to the island of Capri, governing through letters while remaining far from Rome. His successor, Caligula, started promisingly but descended into erratic and cruel behavior that ended with his assassination. Claudius, who became emperor when the Praetorian Guard found him hiding behind a curtain after Caligula's murder, proved surprisingly capable. He conquered Britain, adding a new province to the empire. He built new aqueducts and improved the harbour at Ostia. He married his niece Agrippina, who persuaded him to adopt her son Nero as his heir. Nero began his reign at 17, with good advisors and reasonable policies. But over time, he became infamous for extravagance, cruelty, and theatrical ambitions. He performed in public as a singer and charioteer, behavior scandalous for an emperor. When a great fire destroyed much of Rome in 64, rumors circulated that Nero had started it to make room for his new palace, the Golden House, though this was probably false. Nero blamed Christians for the fire, beginning the first significant persecution of this new religious movement. The Apostle Peter was said to have been crucified in Rome during this persecution, and Paul of Tarsus executed. These deaths would have enormous consequences for world history, though Nero could not have known it. By 68, Nero faced revolts from provincial governors and was declared a public enemy by the Senate. He fled Rome and committed suicide, reportedly saying as he died, "What an artist dies in me." His death ended the Julio-Claudian line and plunged the empire into a brief civil war. The year 69 became known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius each briefly held power, each supported by different armies, and each met violent deaths. Finally, Vespasian, a capable general from a middle-class background, won the struggle and established a new dynasty, the Flavians. Vespasian was a practical, unpretentious man who restored discipline to the army and finances to the treasury. He began construction of the Flavian amphitheatre, which we know as the Colosseum, on the site of Nero's lake in the Golden House. This building, which could hold 50,000 spectators, became the most iconic monument of imperial Rome. Vespasian's elder son Titus succeeded him and completed the Colosseum. Titus's brief reign saw the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79, which buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under volcanic ash. These cities, frozen in time, would provide modern archaeologists with unparalleled insights into daily life in the Roman Empire. Titus's younger brother Domitian succeeded him, but became increasingly autocratic and paranoid. His assassination in 96 ended the Flavian dynasty. What followed was a remarkable period that historians call the rule of the 5 good emperors. The Senate selected Nerva, an elderly senator, to succeed Domitian. Nerva, recognizing his advanced age and lack of military support, adopted Trajan, a successful general of Spanish origin, as his heir. This set a precedent. For the next 80 years, emperors would select capable successors through adoption rather than relying on biological descent. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117, expanded the empire to its greatest extent. He conquered Dacia, roughly modern Romania, securing its gold mines for the empire. He campaigned in the east, briefly conquering Mesopotamia and reaching the Persian Gulf. Rome would never again be so large. Every emperor after Trajan would struggle simply to maintain what he had won. Trajan was beloved for his accessibility and generosity. He built a magnificent new forum in Rome, with markets, libraries, and a column carved with scenes from his Dacian wars. This column still stands, one of the few intact monuments from ancient Rome. Hadrian, who succeeded Trajan, was a very different emperor. Where Trajan had been a conqueror, Hadrian was a consolidator. He abandoned Trajan's eastern conquests as indefensible. He visited every province of the empire, overseeing fortifications and reforms. In Britain, he built a wall across the entire island, separating the Roman province from the unconquered tribes to the north. Hadrian was cultured, intellectual, and passionate about Greek civilization. He wore a beard in the Greek fashion, breaking with the clean-shaven Roman tradition and starting a trend among subsequent emperors. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, creating the magnificent domed structure that still stands today, its vast interior space illuminated by the circular opening at the apex of the dome. Antoninus Pius succeeded Hadrian and ruled for 23 peaceful years. His reign was so uneventful that ancient historians found little to say about it, which is perhaps the highest compliment for a ruler. Peace and stability reigned. The provinces were well governed. The economy flourished. Marcus Aurelius, who became emperor in 161, was a philosopher as well as a ruler. He wrote meditations on Stoic philosophy, personal reflections that reveal a thoughtful, conscientious man struggling with the burden of power. Much of his reign was spent on campaign, defending the empire's northern frontiers against German tribes who were beginning to pressure the borders. Marcus Aurelius's death in 180 marked the end of the era of the good emperors. He broke the pattern of adoptive succession, naming his biological son, Commodus, as heir. This decision would prove disastrous. Commodus was cruel, erratic, and more interested in performing as a gladiator than in governing. His assassination in 192 ended the peaceful era and began a period of increasing instability. But before we turn to the empire's troubles, let us pause and consider what life was like during this long peace. The Pax Romana created conditions that allowed for prosperity and cultural flourishing across the Mediterranean world. The empire was vast, stretching from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Perhaps 60 million people lived within its borders, speaking dozens of languages, but increasingly unified by Latin in the west and Greek in the east. Trade connected distant regions. Spanish olive oil traveled to Britain. Egyptian grain fed Rome. Syrian glass appeared in provincial markets throughout the empire. Cities were the engines of Roman civilization. In the provinces, Local elites competed to beautify their cities with Roman-style buildings. Forums, basilicas, theatres, baths, temples. These structures were not imposed by Rome, but built by local citizens eager to display their status and their connection to the wider Roman world. A typical provincial city would have a forum at its centre, an open plaza surrounded by porticos where merchants set up shops. Public buildings faced the forum, the basilica where legal proceedings took place, the curia where the city council met, temples to Roman and local gods. Broader streets connected the forum to the city gates, while narrower alleys wound between houses and workshops. Public baths were among the most popular institutions. Romans of all classes, slaves excepted, would spend their afternoons at the baths, moving through a sequence of rooms, from warm to hot to cold. The baths were social centres where people met friends, conducted business, heard news, and exercised. Large bath complexes included libraries, gardens, and rooms for massage and grooming. Entertainment was central to urban life. Cities hosted theatrical performances, gladiatorial games, chariot races, and wild beast hunts. These spectacles, often funded by wealthy citizens seeking popularity and office, could be elaborate and expensive. Gladiatorial games in particular fascinated Romans, though the reality was more nuanced than modern imagination suggests. Gladiators were usually enslaved people or prisoners, though some were free volunteers. They trained in specialized schools and fought according to complex rules. While gladiatorial combat could be fatal, it was not always so. Successful gladiators could win freedom, wealth, and fame. Some became popular celebrities, their images appearing on lamps and pottery. Daily life for most people, however, was less dramatic. In the morning, a Roman might stop at a bakery for bread, perhaps with cheese or olives. The wealthier might have a more elaborate breakfast at home, but most Romans ate lightly in the morning. The main meal came in the afternoon, after the day's work and a visit to the baths. Most people worked in agriculture, even city dwellers often maintaining small plots outside the walls. Artisans worked in small workshops, producing pottery, metalwork, textiles, and other goods. Merchants traded in the forums and markets. Professional people, doctors, teachers, architects, served the urban populations. The family remained the basic social unit, though family structures were evolving. The absolute authority of the paterfamilias was being limited by law and custom. Women of the upper classes enjoyed considerable independence, managing property, patronizing artists, and participating in social life. They still could not vote or hold office, but within these limits, they exercised significant influence. Education was highly valued. Wealthy families hired tutors or sent their sons to schools where they learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and above all, rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech. A well-educated Roman could quote Homer and Virgil, could compose elegant letters, could deliver compelling speeches. Education was the path to social advancement for those without distinguished ancestry. Religion remained central to both public and private life. The traditional Roman gods were honored in state ceremonies. Mystery religions from the East, particularly the worship of Isis and Mithras, attracted devotees seeking more personal, spiritual experiences. Philosophy, especially Stoicism, with its emphasis on duty, reason, and acceptance of fate, provided intellectual frameworks for understanding life's challenges. And growing quietly within this diverse religious landscape was Christianity. From its origins as a Jewish sect in Judea, Christianity spread throughout the empire, carried by missionaries like Paul of Tarsus. Christian communities formed in major cities, attracting converts from all social classes. Their exclusive monotheism and refusal to participate in state religious ceremonies sometimes brought them into conflict with authorities, leading to sporadic persecutions. The empire's infrastructure made all of this possible. Roads connected every province, built originally for military purposes, but used by merchants, officials, and travelers. The famous Roman roads, straight and well-engineered, allowed rapid communication across vast distances. A message could travel from Rome to the English Channel in little more than a week. Aqueducts brought water to cities from distant sources. These massive stone structures, some standing over 100 feet high, carried water by gravity alone, following carefully calculated gradients for dozens of miles. The water supplied public fountains, baths, and wealthy houses. This vast, interconnected system, this world of cities and roads and trade routes, all maintained by Roman power and Roman law, was an extraordinary achievement. But it was also fragile, dependent on continued peace and effective administration. And in the 3rd century, that peace would shatter, bringing the empire to the edge of collapse. In the year 235, the Emperor Severus Alexander was assassinated by his own soldiers during a campaign in Germany. His death marked the beginning of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period when the Roman Empire nearly collapsed under the weight of civil war, foreign invasion, plague, and economic breakdown. The crisis emerged from multiple causes that reinforced each other. The empire's frontiers were under increasing pressure. German tribes along the Rhine and Danube were growing more numerous and better organized. In the east, a new Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, challenged Roman control of Mesopotamia and Syria with aggressive warfare and sophisticated military tactics. These external threats required strong military leadership, but they also created opportunities for ambitious generals. Soldiers looked to their commanders for victory and rewards, and commanders who won battles could claim the imperial throne. Between 235 and 284, at least 25 emperors ruled, and most died violently, killed by rivals or their own troops. The rapid turnover of emperors paralyzed governance. Each new ruler focused on securing his position and defeating rivals rather than addressing the empire's structural problems. Provinces were devastated by marching armies. Trade routes became unsafe. Cities that had flourished for centuries found themselves sacked by invaders or caught in civil wars between Roman armies. A plague, probably smallpox, swept through the empire in the mid-3rd century. The disease killed millions, depopulating cities and countryside. Agricultural production declined. Tax revenues fell just as military expenses soared. The government responded by debasing the currency, reducing the silver content of coins to mint more of them. This caused devastating inflation that destroyed savings and disrupted trade. In 260, the Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persian king Shapur during a disastrous campaign in the east. This humiliation, a Roman emperor held prisoner by Rome's enemies, symbolized how far the empire had fallen. According to some Persian sources, though the exact details are disputed, Shapur treated Valerian with great cruelty, and the emperor died in captivity. Parts of the empire began to break away. In the east, the city of Palmyra, under Queen Zenobia, established a short-lived independent empire controlling Syria, Egypt, and part of Asia Minor. In the west, a succession of Gallic emperors ruled Britain, Gaul, and Spain independently of Rome for 15 years. It seemed possible that the Roman Empire would simply fragment into smaller kingdoms, that the unity forged over centuries would dissolve. But beginning in 268, a series of capable military emperors from the Balkans gradually restored order. Claudius Gothicus defeated a massive invasion of Goths in the Balkans. Aurelian reconquered Palmyra and brought the breakaway Gallic Empire back under central control. He also built massive new walls around Rome, walls that still stand today, a testament to the insecurity of the age. But it was Diocletian, who became emperor in 284, who truly transformed the empire and ensured its survival. Diocletian was a soldier from Dalmatia, of humble origin but possessed of extraordinary organizational ability. He recognized that the empire was too large and too threatened for one man to govern effectively. His solution was revolutionary. He created the tetrarchy, the rule of four, dividing the empire between two senior emperors called Augusti and two junior emperors called Caesars. Each ruled a portion of the empire, with the Caesars expected to succeed the Augusti in an orderly transition of power. Diocletian took the east with his capital at Nicomedia in Asia Minor. His co-Augustus Maximian ruled the west from Milan. The junior Caesars governed sub-regions in the Balkans and Gaul. This system allowed rapid military response to threats on multiple frontiers and provided clear succession planning. But Diocletian did more than reorganize administration. He reformed the army, separating frontier troops who defended the borders from mobile field armies that could respond to invasions. He reformed taxation, establishing regular assessments based on land and population. He attempted to control inflation through price and wage controls, though these proved largely ineffective. Diocletian also transformed the nature of the emperorship. Where earlier emperors had maintained the fiction of being merely first citizens, Diocletian presented himself as dominus, lord and master. He wore purple silk robes embroidered with gold. He expected those who approached him to prostrate themselves. He surrounded himself with elaborate court ceremony drawn from Persian models. This shift from principate, the rule of the first citizen, to dominate, the rule of the lord, marked a fundamental change in how Romans understood their government. The pretense of restored republic was abandoned. Rome was now openly an autocracy, ruled by an emperor whose power was absolute. In 305, after 21 years of successful rule, Diocletian did something unprecedented. He voluntarily abdicated, retiring to a palace he had built on the Dalmatian coast. He forced his co-Augustus, Maximian, to abdicate as well, and the two Caesars became the new Augusti as planned. But the tetrarchy did not survive Diocletian's retirement. The new rulers quarreled. Maximian came out of retirement. Civil wars erupted again. What emerged from this conflict was another sole emperor, but one who would transform the empire even more fundamentally than Diocletian had. Constantine, the son of one of the Caesars, won control of the entire empire by 324. He was a brilliant general and a shrewd politician, but his most significant act was religious. Constantine converted to Christianity. The reasons for his conversion are debated. According to Christian sources, Constantine saw a vision before a crucial battle in 312. He supposedly saw a cross in the sky with the words, "In hoc signo vinces," "In this sign you will conquer." Whether the vision was genuine religious experience, political calculation, or retrospective legend, Constantine won the battle and attributed his victory to the Christian God. Constantine's conversion transformed Christianity from a persecuted minority religion into the favored faith of the empire. He ended persecutions, returned confiscated property, and began to patronize churches. He exempted clergy from certain taxes and duties. He appointed Christians to important positions. Over the following decades, Constantine and his successors, with one brief exception, continued to favor Christianity. Temples to the old gods were closed or converted to churches. Pagan practices were restricted and eventually banned. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire, and the empire had become officially Christian. This transformation had profound effects. The church became intimately connected with imperial power. Bishops became important political figures. Religious disputes became matters of state concern. When Christians disagreed about theological questions, emperors convened councils to establish orthodox positions and suppress heresy. Constantine also made another transformative decision. He founded a new capital, Constantinople, on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. Located on the Bosporus, the strait connecting the Mediterranean and Black Seas, Constantinople was perfectly positioned to control trade routes and defend the wealthy eastern provinces. Constantine adorned his new city with monuments, churches, and public buildings. He moved the Senate to Constantinople, creating a rival to Rome. The old capital remained symbolically important, but real power increasingly resided in the east. After Constantine's death in 337, his sons divided the empire among themselves. The unity he had achieved fragmented. For the rest of the 4th century, the empire oscillated between division and reunification, between multiple emperors ruling separate regions and brief periods when one emperor controlled everything. The last emperor to rule the entire empire was Theodosius, who died in 395. He divided the empire between his two sons. Arcadius received the east with its capital at Constantinople, and Honorius received the west with its capital at Ravenna in northern Italy, Milan having proven too vulnerable to barbarian raids. This division would prove permanent. Though emperors in both halves continued to claim authority over the whole empire, in practice, East and West were now separate states with separate administrations, separate armies, and increasingly separate identities. The Western Empire faced mounting pressures in the 5th century. Germanic peoples, themselves pushed by the Huns migrating from Central Asia, pressed against and eventually crossed the Rhine and Danube frontiers. These were not sudden invasions by vast armies, but gradual infiltrations by groups seeking land and security within the empire. Roman authorities often negotiated with these groups, granting them land in exchange for military service. But this policy gradually transformed the western provinces. Large areas came under the control of Germanic kings, who nominally served Rome, but in practice ruled independently. In 410, Visigoths led by Alaric sacked Rome itself. This event shocked the Roman world. Rome had not been captured by foreign enemies in 800 years. The sack was relatively restrained by ancient standards, lasting only 3 days, and with Alaric specifically protecting churches. But symbolically, it marked a turning point. More Germanic groups established kingdoms on imperial territory. The Vandals crossed into North Africa and captured Carthage, cutting off the grain supply that fed Italy. The Burgundians settled in eastern Gaul. The Franks established themselves in northern Gaul. Britain, never fully Romanized, was abandoned by imperial forces and gradually settled by Angles and Saxons. The Western emperors became increasingly powerless figures, controlled by Germanic generals who commanded what remained of the Roman armies. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was a teenager placed on the throne by his father, a Roman general of barbarian descent. In 476, a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus. Rather than proclaim himself emperor, Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that there was no need for an emperor in the West. He would govern Italy as king, nominally under the authority of the emperor in Constantinople. This event, the deposition of the last Western emperor, is traditionally used as the date for the fall of the Roman Empire. But it did not feel like a dramatic ending at the time. No one declared that the empire had fallen. The Senate continued to meet in Rome. People still considered themselves Romans. The change was in who held actual power, and that had been gradually shifting for decades. The Eastern Empire, meanwhile, continued to flourish. Constantinople remained the largest, wealthiest, most sophisticated city in the Christian world. The eastern provinces, less affected by Germanic migrations, maintained their prosperity. The Eastern emperors would continue to rule for another 1,000 years, until Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. What then do we make of the Roman Empire's end? If we focus on the West, we see a gradual transformation rather than a sudden collapse. Roman institutions, Roman law, Latin language, and Christian religion all continued. The Germanic kingdoms that emerged in the empire's territory considered themselves successors to Rome, not destroyers of it. The bishops of Rome, the popes, maintained continuity with the imperial past and would become the most enduring institution of post-Roman Europe. Charlemagne would be crowned Roman emperor in 800, founding what would become the Holy Roman Empire. As late as the 20th century, rulers claimed descent from or connection to Rome. If we consider the East, the empire never ended, but evolved into what we call the Byzantine Empire, though the Byzantines always called themselves Romans. Their empire preserved classical learning, Roman law, and Christian theology through centuries when Western Europe was fragmented and often chaotic. The legacy of Rome extended far beyond political institutions. Roman law, codified by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, became the foundation of legal systems throughout Europe and eventually the world. Latin evolved into the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. The Latin alphabet is used to write countless languages. Roman engineering influenced architecture for millennia. The dome of the Pantheon inspired countless later domes. Roman roads formed the foundation of European road networks. Aqueduct construction techniques influenced modern civil engineering. Roman literature, the poetry of Virgil and Ovid, the histories of Livy and Tacitus, the philosophy of Cicero and Seneca, became foundational texts of Western education. The Roman rhetorical tradition shaped how people learned to think and argue. Roman ideals of civic virtue, citizenship, and public service influenced political thought for centuries. Perhaps most fundamentally, Rome created a model of universal empire, a single political system encompassing diverse peoples and cultures united by common law and shared citizenship. This model, though never perfectly realized and often maintained by force, represented an alternative to fragmentation and endless conflict among small states. As we come to the end of this long story, we might return to where we began, to those 7 hills above the Tiber River. From a small settlement of shepherds and farmers, Rome grew to dominate the Mediterranean world. For more than 1,000 years, from the founding of the Republic to the fall of Constantinople, Roman civilization shaped the lives of millions. The Romans were not always admirable. Their empire was built on conquest and maintained by slavery. They could be cruel, arrogant, and ruthlessly pragmatic. But they also created law, built cities, preserved knowledge, and established an ideal of ordered, civilized life that continued to inspire long after their empire's power had faded. In the ruins that dot the Mediterranean landscape, the aqueducts and amphitheaters, the forums and temples, we see traces of their ambition and achievement. In our languages, our laws, our political concepts, we live with their inheritance. We remain, in ways both obvious and subtle, the heirs of Rome. Picture one final image as you drift towards sleep. The sun setting over the Forum as it has set for thousands of years. The columns casting long shadows across worn paving stones. The Colosseum glowing golden in the last light. The Pantheon's bronze doors closed for the evening. And in the gathering dusk, the sound of church bells calling the faithful to prayer in a language the ancient Romans would recognize, in a tradition they would understand. This is Rome, ancient and yet still present, gone and yet never truly departed. May you rest well with the weight of history settling softly around you, like dust on ancient stones.